Hello.
Hello there.
Hello.
How are y'all doing today? Welcome back to Restoration Fellowship and the Omer count.
Yes.
This is day 34 of the counting of the Omer. And so we are ready to get back into the book of Hebrews. So we're in Hebrews chapter 10 if you want to start turning there. Just remember, if you're watching, that you share the video and pass it around and write your comments or questions down at the bottom, and we'll try to get back to them so we can answer those. But Vicki, did you want to say the blessing tonight?
I do, thank you. Today is day 6 of week 5 of the counting of the Omer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kitshanu b'mitzvoto v'tzivanu al shefarat ha'omer. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us about the counting of the Omer. Amen.
All right. So we're ready to get back into the book of Hebrews. We took a break a little bit last night in the book of Isaiah and looking at the kingdom and some of the things that it has to say
Things leading up to the kingdom.
about that. And so we are here. Now, you want to give us a brief rundown of catching us back up on the mindset of Hebrews?
Well, remember, we're talking about the priesthood, about the difference between the Melchizedek priesthood and the Levitical priesthood, right? The Levitical priesthood, of course, came about through the Mosaic covenant. However, the Melchizedek priesthood was more with the Abrahamic covenant. Remember, he met Melchizedek, and Melchizedek blessed him right before God made that covenant with him in Genesis chapter 15. And so he becomes more the priest of that covenant. And that is the covenant of redemption. Okay? The covenant of the land and the descendants. It is not a covenant that requires both people to be obligated to something. Only God passed through the pieces. God said, this covenant I will take care of. Right? The Mosaic covenant, both parties are responsible for.
They both have parts to play or obligations.
Yes.
But in the Abrahamic covenant, only God obligated himself to secure our redemption.
Correct. Yes, in the Mosaic covenant, it was more like a ketubah or a marriage contract. And so it's more of a contract between husband and wife of what each will be obligated to do. Okay? And of course, the wife in this instance is Israel herself, and she is obligating herself to obey her husband. You know, it's interesting that not until very long ago, the concept of a wife saying in her vows that she promises to obey her husband, well, that is a biblical concept, because that comes right out of that marriage contract, the Mosaic covenant between God and Israel. Right? Everything, God tells us to do, we will do. Right? So that is that covenant. And so we pick back up in chapter 10, keeping in mind that we are talking about the difference between the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant, the difference between the Melchizedek priesthood and the Aaronic priesthood, the difference between Yeshua's sacrifice and the sacrifice of animals.
And the daily sacrifices and things, or the yearly sacrifices that would go on in the temple. And again, these were people that had been maybe kicked out of the temple or the synagogues and such, and were wondering, how can we get back in right standing? What do we have to give up to get that?
So just real quick, remember, Abrahamic covenant goes with Melchizedek, goes with redemption, and ultimately goes with Yeshua's sacrifice. The Mosaic covenant, right? The Mosaic covenant goes with the Aaronic priesthood and the sacrifice of animals. So different. Different. Okay.
All right. So chapter 10 starts off with establishing that reality. The Torah or the law, was what he's talking about there. The Torah has a shadow of the good things to come, not the form itself of the realities. So it's right off the bat, it's establishing that the Torah, which is the Mosaic covenant,
right,
is just a picture, is a representation of the greater things that are happening, that are going to happen in order to secure our salvation, our eternity with him. This, by saying that, though, it's not a negation of or a downplay of the importance of the Mosaic covenant, or the sacrifices that are going in the temple, or the Aaronic priesthood. He's not trying to diminish their significance or their importance, but he is trying to say that those are preparing us, those are pointing us toward the sacrifice of Yeshua, the redemption that's provided under the Abrahamic covenant.
Well, ultimately, the Mosaic covenant, again, since it's a marriage contract, is also pointing us to the reality of the marriage between God and his people. Right? And that life we will have with him in the kingdom and in eternity. It points us to that.
And so to downplay the Mosaic covenant, to downplay that aspect of things, is to basically squash on the whole idea of Yeshua is the bride and we are the bridegroom.
Yeshua is the bridegroom and we are the bride.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry.
You got that backwards.
But yeah, the Mosaic covenant is what gives us that picture of the bride and the bridegroom.
Yes.
And so if we don't want to do away with that, because it establishes that relationship. But it's not established, but it's the terms of that relationship that he lays out. And it's the redemption that's the start of our relationship. He seeks us out, and he redeems us from our slavery. He redeems us from our sin. And but everything else is, the Mosaic covenant is still valid and still important for that walk in that marriage. So even though he says Torah has a shadow of the good things to come, not the form of the realities, not the form itself of the realities, is not, again, it's not downplaying the importance of it, but our salvation is not based on it.
Right.
All right. For this reason, it can never, by means of the same sacrifices they offer constantly, year after year, make perfect those who draw near. Our sin is not going to be removed through the sacrifices going on in the temple. It's not designed for that, and it never was. It was never designed to take away sin. It was to provide a covering for sin until the full redemption that comes through the offering of the Messiah. And
again, these sacrifices he's talking about are primarily in the book of Hebrews, the sacrifices of the Day of Atonement. So that was a national atonement, right? The national atonement that is more akin to when Yeshua returns and he separates the sheep from the goats, right? It's that bringing in of the entire nation into the land of Israel. And we've got to keep in mind that there's always the individual redemption, but then there is that corporate atonement, that corporate
choosing.
God bringing in that corporate body in full, right? So all Israel will be saved, not just the individuals.
Right, and that's how we've talked about the whole concept of election. In a lot of ways, election is in many ways a corporate concept. And that's why within the same sentence, you are the chosen people of God, but you have to choose this day whom you will serve.
Right.
Election is much more of a corporate issue and an identity that is bestowed to a nation and a people. And then within that chosen people status, each person has to choose whom they will serve, whether they will live in that function that they have been chosen to. So again, these sacrifices they offer constantly year after year. They cannot make perfect those who come to him, those who draw near in that manner. So again, the Mosaic or the Aaronic sacrifices there in the temple are not about salvation. They cannot take away our sin.
No.
Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? So he's making this logical point here. If they could take away our sin, if they could make us perfect, then why do we have to do them over and over again? Would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshipers, suddenly now cleansed once and for all, would no longer have consciousness of sins? But in these sacrifices is a reminder of sins year after year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins.
And what is sin?
Sin is the breaking of the Torah, as 1 John 3:4 talks about.
Right.
So again, it's all of the services going on in the temple with the service of the Aaronic priesthood and the sacrifices. Yes, they cover the sins of the people, but they also remind them that a greater redemption is necessary. Mm-hmm. Something more has got to happen. Otherwise, this problem, it's highlighting the problem. It's a Band-Aid kind of a thing, and it's highlighting the fact that a greater cure needs to take place.
Well, and also, too, we have, in a lot of ways, we in the church don't really have an understanding of the sacrifices and what they were really for. Again, redemption occurs under the Abrahamic covenant. Mm-hmm. Salvation, justification under the Abrahamic covenant. But even as husband and wife, now that they've come together and there's that marriage of husband and wife, there are times, even within a marriage, a husband and wife will sometimes have a disagreement and go different ways. I
have no idea what that's talking about.
You better not.
Well, certainly not the going separate ways. I was saying that before you made that statement.
But, in terms of what they think, they'll go in different directions. And there's, even within a marriage, there's that coming back together after a little bit of a schism. Mm-hmm. Right? The marriage hasn't ended.
Better not.
But you know what I'm saying? The marriage hasn't ended, but the wife hasn't lived up to her obligations, or the husband hasn't lived up to his obligations in the moment. Now, with this situation between God and Israel, God always lives up to his obligations. Yep. So the fault is with her. The fault is with the bride, with the people. And so, there may be that schism. There may be the time when God needs to discipline his people, but there's always supposed to be that coming back together. Yeah. And when the people of Israel would go to the tabernacle, or they would go to the temple, the sin offerings, yes, were for their breaking of the Torah, but at the same time, it was also just for actual purification, to actually be pure in the presence of God Almighty. They were going before their king. They were going before the God of the universe. Mm-hmm. As sinful human beings. You do not come before God empty-handed. Mm-hmm. It's more of those type of concepts than it is the concept of salvation. The salvation, the redemption has already taken place. The marriage has already taken place. But then there's that living out of the marriage. Mm-hmm. Okay? And
it's akin to that, it's how someone can be blameless and how that's different from being sinless.
Right.
Blameless is you're doing everything that's required of you in the Torah, because it's acknowledging, the Torah acknowledges that you're going to sin, and you're going to need to make an atonement. You're going to need to make a sin offering. Right. And so it has provisions for all of those things spelled out and laid out. So when it talks about Simeon and Anna, at the temple, at the presentation of Yeshua, when he's, 8 days old and such, it talks about him being blameless.
Or Zechariah and Elizabeth.
Zechariah and Elizabeth. It talks about them being blameless. That doesn't mean they're perfect, but as far as everything that they have required to do, and the offerings and things that they're supposed to do at the temple, they've taken care of those things.
They are in right standing with God.
To the best of their ability, to the best of the system that God has set up for them to live under. And so, but this is acknowledging that system, while it does its job, is pointing to a greater status and a change of status that they are still waiting for.
Right.
And that is the redemption that takes place under the priesthood of Melchizedek.
Correct.
That's the redemption that takes place under the promise of the Abrahamic covenant, of which they have only had a foretaste of it, that we have not seen it fully laid out yet.
And again, the goal is the kingdom and eternity, where the husband and wife, the bridegroom and the bride, are together forever. And never again on different pages.
So back again in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 3. In these sacrifices is a reminder of sins year after year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And here comes the contrast. So when Messiah comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not delight. And then I said, behold, I come to do your will, O God. And in the scroll of the book it is written of me. So, I mean, he's basically saying, my role as Messiah, the role of Messiah is not to come and offer the same offerings and sacrifices that have been going on for such a long time, but to do something else, to inaugurate this redemption that has been promised. So Messiah's role is not to do the same old thing, is to do something greater. And so after saying the above, this is verse 8, sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor did you delight in them, those which are offered according to Torah. All right, he's not negating their importance or their role.
No, he's not.
But then he said, behold, I come to do your will. All right, that's not my will, but your will be done. He says that in the Garden of Gethsemane. He takes away the first to establish this second. Remember, he's contrasting the Mosaic covenant with the fulfillment of the promise of that renewed covenant and that idea in Jeremiah 31, which is reestablishing the idea of redemption, an unbroken covenant.
Right. That idea of that relationship has been broken, and so it requires a death even for the marriage to be put back together again.
And even God talked about it. I gave faithless Israel a certificate of divorce. I mean, he's talked about it in those terms before in the prophets. Because
he wants that relationship with her, and he went through great lengths to have it reinstated.
So yeah, he takes away the first to establish this second. By his will, we have been made holy through the offering of the body of Messiah, Yeshua, once and for all.
Redemption. And
remember, even the believing community, even the ones that believed in Yeshua, we're talking here in the 60s, mid-60s AD, is when this was likely written. That means Yeshua has been crucified, buried, and raised for about 30 years or more. And all this time, the believing community has been going to the temple and doing the sacrifices and doing everything required of them in the Torah.
Yes.
That has not stopped. Paul highlights that in his life in the book of Acts. Every time he makes a defense of himself when he's on trial and he hears the accusations, he's saying, no, I've been doing everything I'm supposed to do by the Torah. I'm not speaking against it. I'm not speaking against the temple. I'm not doing any of that stuff. So they were participating in these things, and they did not see a conflict between, now that I believe in Yeshua, I have nothing to do with that stuff anymore. They didn't believe that. They didn't act that way. that was something that was an attitude taken on later. The further the community got away from its Jewish foundation, the more hostile it got towards the Jewish people. Was more the attitude that came later.
And again, they had been kicked out of the temple. So in being kicked out of the temple, they are needing to be consoled, because they, it's very easy to say, okay, wait a minute. Does that mean I no longer have access to God? Because that's at the temple, right? I want to have access to God. And so
I want to do everything required of me.
Right. And they were considering giving up Yeshua in order to get back in the temple. And so in essence, they were considering giving up the Abrahamic covenant in order to only have the Mosaic covenant. But no, it's the Abrahamic covenant first, then the Mosaic covenant. And if any gets put on hold in terms of some of the terms, it's the Mosaic covenant. And the reason why it's put on hold is because they were being thrown out of the temple, and then the temple was destroyed. We are in exile. I know we as Americans don't like to think that way, but as the believing community, we are in exile.
Until the kingdom is restored.
That's right. And the Jews even understand that until there's a temple, they are in exile. Doesn't matter if they live in Israel or not, or in Jerusalem or not. Until there is a temple, they are technically in exile. Because they do not have a way back into the presence of God. Now we understand that we have that, and he's going to get into that. We have that way into the presence of God through Yeshua. And that's what the writers of Hebrews is trying to comfort the people with.
Because we have a high priest who is serving in the temple right now.
Right.
The temple in the heavens, he is seated at the right hand of God. So yes, we have that access in ways that the earthly don't. And so he by his will, we have been made holy. We have been made holy. Again, that's what it says. The sacrifices cannot make you perfect, because they're offered year after year after year. But we have been made holy. We have been redeemed. We have had that sin nature dealt with, even though we still live in the world with it.
Right.
But we have been made holy in his sight through the offering of the body of Messiah once for all. Verse 11 of...
Hold on a second. I want to go back to actually that verse 9 again, because I wanted to say this.
Which phrase?
The idea that he takes away the first to establish the second, right? And also we're talking about the Mosaic covenant and the new covenant, right? This is a statement that's also showing how they believed that Yeshua was coming back quickly.
Yes.
Right? He was coming back quickly. And he's taken away the first in order to establish the second. And the second, really takes away sins and puts it as far as the east is from the west. The second puts that Torah on our minds and our hearts. That second says that he is our God and we are his people, and we're going to be together.
And he is ruling and reigning from Jerusalem in power.
We won't need to teach each other anymore.
And this is a get up and let's go kind of a statement.
Yes.
He's eagerly waiting for that establishment. And
all of that, the second has not been, and still has not been, even today, has not been fully enacted. And that is something that we as the believing community have to come to terms with. Because it will not be fully enacted until the time of the kingdom, until he's on his throne. And so we are still living in that first. We are still living and waiting for everything to be made new.
We've received
when the king is on the throne.
We've received the down payment.
Yes.
We have received the promise.
Yes.
And that guarantees what is to come later.
Right.
But we're still living in that tension of we have it and yet we don't have it.
Right.
We have it and yet we're waiting for the full consummation of it.
Yes.
And so, yes, that's a very good point on that. So we have been, verse 10, we've been made holy through the offering of the body of Messiah Yeshua once for all. His offering is different from the priests at the temple. He only had to do it one time, and that dealt with it. Verse 11, indeed, every Cohen stands. Remember where Yeshua is. He is not standing, he is seated at the right hand of the majesty and power.
Yeah, and the writer's going to remind them of that in just a second, yes.
Every priest stands day by day serving and offering the same sacrifices again and again, which can never take away sins. That's the Jewish understanding of everything happening in the temple. They know and understand that this is not for salvation.
This can't take away my sin because I'm going to leave this temple and I'm going to sin again. And the next time I come back, I got to bring another sacrifice.
Yeah. But on the other hand, verse 12, when this one, talking about Messiah, when this one offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. In other words, his work is done. It is finished. In a very literal sense. He sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from then on until his enemies are made a footstool for his feet. And
waiting for the kingdom.
Yeah. And what is he waiting for in that sense? What is he waiting for? Who is he waiting for a word from?
The Father.
He's waiting for that word from the Father. No one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son, but only the Father. Right? So he is waiting for that moment where the Father says, now is the appointed time. Right. Go and gather your bride from all the corners of the earth and bring them to Jerusalem, to Israel.
Right.
For this establishment of the kingdom. So even Yeshua, and that's hard to think about that, Yeshua himself is waiting for that time. It's not just us who's waiting for that moment. It's also Yeshua who is waiting for that time. So you hear that again. When Messiah offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from then on until his enemies are made a footstool for his feet. So do you think he's looking forward to that day?
Very much so.
I think he's looking forward to it a whole lot more than we are.
It's his wedding day.
Yeah.
And he understands more of what that means than we do.
Yeah. So Yeshua himself is looking forward to and anticipating and waiting for the day, the appointed time that the Lord says, go and collect your bride. So verse 14 of Hebrews 10, for by one offering he has perfected forever those being made holy. Okay, it's not like the sins at the temple.
No. The sacrifices at the temple.
Yeah. See, I've been talking weird today. It's not like the sacrifices at the temple that have to be offered over and over again.
Right.
This is a one-time thing, and your sins have been dealt with. You have been perfected, and then through that, having that sin nature dealt with, you are being made holy. That's the start of the process. And then what do we call the process of being made holy throughout the rest of our lives?
Sanctification.
That's sanctification. And what fills that role in the life of the believer?
Discipleship.
Discipleship. And what's the discipleship program of God?
The Torah.
The Torah. So that's his process. Our sin has been dealt with, and now we are continuing the process of being made holy, and that's what the Torah of God is for. That's what it's designed to do. It's designed to sanctify us as we walk this walk of faith.
The sanctifying process cannot replace the
redemptive process.
That brings eternal redemption.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
sorry, did I mess you up? Verse 15, so the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, also testifies to us, for after saying, this is the covenant that I will cut with them, after those days, says Adonai, I will put my Torah upon their hearts, and upon their minds I will write it. Then he says, I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more, their Torah-less deeds no more.
Right.
Okay, that's Jeremiah 31. That's the language of the new covenant. So in the new covenant, in this renewed and established through redemption covenant, the Torah, which is the Mosaic covenant, is put here, is moved internally to make it not a have to, but a want to. And so, and when he does that, then the whole issue of sin is over. When that is fully enacted and inaugurated, and we're not there yet, but I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. All of that is settled and done.
Remember, the enemy will be locked up at that point. Right? So for those who...
The 1,000 years of the millennial kingdom.
I mean, whew, can you imagine not having to deal with that anymore?
That temptation, or that
Right,
that voice in your head,
that,
trying to get you to break the Torah of God and the commands of God.
Yeah, he's going to be locked up. And so the people of God are going to experience a freedom like they've never known.
And so verse 18, he says, now where there is removal of these, there is no longer an offering for sin. So you're not going to have the need to even make an offering because your sin has been dealt with.
And yet, when he comes back and establishes the temple, according to Ezekiel, there will be sin offerings offered in that temple. Now, we don't know. Are they going to be continual sin offerings or just at the beginning of the millennium and then no more? That we don't know. But Ezekiel mentions sin offerings.
Somehow or another, something is going to be offered at the temple.
Yes.
And we're not necessarily privy to all of that, of how that's going to work. But again, who's going to work? Who's going to be in charge of that?
Messiah is going to be in
Messiah
charge of
is. He'll be the high priest in the order of Melchizedek, under which everything in the Aaronic priesthood is going to work, serve, and operate.
Yes, because remember, Levi offered tithes to Melchizedek because he was still in the loins of Abraham when Abraham offered that tithe. And Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and the greater blesses the lesser.
Is your head spinning yet?
It's a spin, y'all, but Hebrews is deep. Hebrews is deep. We can't just pull up a few verses and read on the surface and think we understand this book. It is deep. It has the entire understanding of the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant behind it. It's got the understanding of Melchizedek behind it. It has these deep Jewish understandings, stuff that we in the church have not really touched for 2,000 years behind this book. And so we've got to be able to come to this book and go, okay,
what did it mean to them?
What did it mean to them? What are, original intent, right? What was this writer trying to say to the people who were actually reading this letter? Okay? And they were a very Jewish audience.
People who were living in this system.
Yes.
People who understood it.
Who loved it. Who loved it. They don't want to leave. They're getting kicked out. They don't want to be on the outside of the temple, away from their understanding of the presence of God and away from the rest of their people. This was a tragedy to them. This wasn't, oh, yay.
Don't have to do that anymore.
Don't have to do that no more. No, this was a tragedy. This was breaking their hearts.
And we look at it as man, I'm so glad I'm not one of them.
Right.
We have the exact opposite approach. But when we get to the kingdom, when we get to his return, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to be operating and functioning much more like Hebrews than our life and everything right now, where it's not.
Right.
And so we're going to have to adapt to that at that point. We're going to be receiving that kind of correction and having to learn this system, because this is what, in some way or form, again, we don't know exactly how that operates with Messiah in the head position, but it's going to look a lot more like Hebrews than what we're doing now.
I posted on my Facebook page just the other day about a message from Joel Richardson. He's an evangelical. Okay, so he's not messianic. And at the end of his Bible study, he's going through Daniel right now, he made a statement about the temple that the Jews are wanting to build now, right? And one thing he specifically talked about was how that temple was going to be considered by God to be holy. It is going to be consecrated. It cannot be defiled unless it has been consecrated. And the world and the believing community, the Christian community, is not ready for that reality.
Mm-mm. It's going to be a major point of contention and division, even within the believing community. And he was encouraging pastors and teachers, is like, you need to get your people ready to understand that this is what's coming.
Right.
And the whole discussion about how do we participate or not. I mean, it's like, yeah, I understand that's going to be a part of the big debate. I mean, are we even going to be allowed?
Exactly.
But
we might be right back in the book of Hebrews, just being on the outside looking in, right?
Right. But he's like, but the fact that it would be up and functioning and operating, because I mean, that's prophecy for the end times. There's got to be something that's happening there. So we know it's coming in some way or form. He's like, so we need to prepare the people of God when that stuff starts happening, of how to approach it, right, and what that all means,
right,
and not get sucked up into the whole let's condemn Israel phase,
because that's going to be there. That's going to be there, huge.
Mm-hmm. That's not the side you want to be on.
No.
Anyway, so
verse 19.
Yeah. Verse 18 is where there is removal of these, there's no longer an offering for sin. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have boldness to enter into the holies by the blood of Yeshua. Remember, in being kicked out of the temple, corporately speaking, they were not allowed to go into the holies. Right. When the high priest goes into the holies and does his service and his ministry there before on the Day of Atonement, he is a representative of all the people. And it is as if all of them are there with him in that moment. And if they're kicked out of the temple, that means that they're not there with him.
Right.
And that's the tragic part of it. That's the heartbreaking part of it for them. But he's saying, look, because we have a high priest who is serving not on the earthly temple, but he's serving in the one that's in the heavens, the true temple, the true tabernacle. And he is there serving as the high priest in the order of Melchizedek. We are in the holies. We are in his presence, just as what the Day of Atonement is foreshadowing. And so don't feel like you've been cut off, because you're not. So he inaugurated a new and living way for us through the curtain that is his flesh. We also have a high priest, a Kohen Gadol, over God's household.
Amen.
So the household of God, those who have been given the right to be called children of God, of which now Gentiles are included in that. We have a high priest who is ministering on behalf of that house.
In the order of Melchizedek, right?
Mm-hmm. And again, that's how he puts it in the book of Ephesians, which we talked about a few nights ago.
Seems like a while
ago. It does seem like a while ago. But when you get to the book of Ephesians, what does he say in chapter 2, verse 19? So then you, talking about the Gentiles, are no longer strangers and foreigners, but you are fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household. So we are a part of his household, and so we are able to go and participate as if we are there, because he is there.
Right.
So verse 22, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 22. So let us draw near, and that's that concept of korban.
Yes.
Let us draw near with a true heart and in full assurance of faith. You haven't been cut off. You haven't been kicked out and lost to the presence of God.
No.
So let us draw near with a true heart and a full assurance of faith, with hearts sprinkled. Again, that's what happens on the Day of Atonement. Mm-hmm. Sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and body washed with pure water.
Living water.
The living water, which was a part of that, all of that ceremony in that time period and such. Let us hold fast the unwavering confession of hope, for he who promised is faithful. Let us hold fast to it. We can't let go of this. We can't consider giving up Yeshua in order to go back. Hold fast to your high priest. Hold fast to the tzitzit of his garment, so to speak.
To the eternal redemption
that he promised.
That he offers.
Yeah.
Right?
And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good deeds.
Uh-oh. We're coming.
I know. Did you have anything you wanted to say about 24?
Go ahead.
So we're about encouraging one another, yes, not to go back, not to give up, but to be faithfully doing what he has called us to do in making disciples, in living the life that you can. As much as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. Mm-hmm. If you can go and participate in those things, if they'll let you go, but if they don't,
they require you to give up Yeshua. It's not an option.
No, it's not. So keep each other accountable and stirred up in that regard. Mm-hmm. Then here is verse 25. And Tim, if you remember, this is the one that I was telling you about the other day, that you should spend some special time looking at this one. It says, and do not neglect our own meetings, as is the habit of some, but let us encourage one another, all the more as you see the day approaching.
Because they thought it was approaching.
Yeah, they thought it was right around the corner. And so even if you've been kicked out of the temple, even if you've been kicked out of the synagogue, you should still keep meeting together. You should still keep coming together as the people of God, mm-hmm, to accomplish the purposes that he has for you. And there's something really, really interesting when you take a look at that Hebrews 25. And I like to look at the Blue Letter Bible. It has a pretty easy access to the Greek and Hebrew when you're looking at those things. And some of your translations will say, "Do not neglect the assembling together." Okay, the assembly is an important word. It's an old concept. We've talked before on these different nights that that the church is, the word that's used there is typically ecclesia. Mm-hmm. It's talking about that idea of fellowship, but that is an older concept. It's a concept that is used even in the Old Testament to describe Israel, mm-hmm, to describe the people of God. And the evidence of that is what is in Acts chapter 8?
7.
Acts chapter 7?
With Stephen's sermon.
Yeah, if you look at it, especially in the King James,
yeah.
Hebrews chapter 7, verse 38, he says, "This is the one who was in the church in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our fathers." All right? So the King James will translate that as the church in the wilderness. And he's referring to Israel. He's referring to the people of God back in the days of the Exodus. So the church, the concept of the assembly of the people,
of the ecclesia,
that's the word that they used back in the Septuagint to translate these passages.
Yes.
Ecclesia was used in the Septuagint to talk about Israel in the Old Testament.
The Septuagint was written a couple hundred years before Yeshua.
Mm-hmm. So the birthplace of the people of God, we like to talk about it in terms of Acts chapter 2. And that's that's the messianic community. But that's not that's not the people. The people of God were birthed really back here at the Exodus and with the calling of Abraham, really.
Yes, and then the bringing out of the nation and the nation receiving that.
Yeah. And so this is the believing community. And what's interesting here, do not neglect our assembling together or our own meetings. And when you look at that word, we like to think of it, that's talking about the church is usually what we try to translate it as.
I'm laughing for a reason.
But when you go back and you look at this passage in the Greek, and you get to that word about assembling together, it's not ecclesia that he uses at all.
It's not.
And it's in fact a very Jewish Hebrew carryover kind of a word.
Yep.
And it's the word epi-synagogue.
Did you hear it?
Now, what word does that remind you of?
Epe is just a prefix, so the main word there is synagogue.
Yeah. So do not neglect the synagogue. That's really what he's saying.
Until they kick you out, you keep going.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we have evidence, archaeological evidence, that up in Galilee, Orthodox Jews and Messianic Jews continued to go to the same synagogues for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. Fellowship, lived together side by side.
Buried in the same tombs together. So
families might even have been
a mixture
on
of
both sides,
right?
And so when he's talking about this, it's I look at the definition of how that shows up in Strong's and such. It says a gathering together in one place or the religious assembly, and then it says of Christians. And especially a Christian meeting for worship, but the word is synagogue is
definitely the word
has a different connotation to it than that,
which is interesting because again in the Galilee, this is when Constantine came in and forced people to build churches instead of synagogues. The believers in the Galilee were the last to hold out of refusing to build churches because they had their synagogues.
And they didn't want to separate from the synagogue, which is the synagogue is what had the Torah. The synagogue is what had the scriptures. The synagogue had all of those things of which the community of faith was built around and what maintained their identity. And so, do not neglect or do not give up the synagogue. Even if they're kicked out of the temple, even if they're kicked out of even Jerusalem, don't become so hardened in your attitude. Don't become so despairing or angry or various other things that you want to say, well, fine, I'm out of here. I'm never going to go talk to you again.
And remember, it ends with, as you see the day approaching. Right? Well, when that day approaches, all Israel's going to be saved. Right? So they're not going to want to separate from their Jewish brothers and sisters in that sense. They're expecting the return and the kingdom to be inaugurated at any time. They're expecting their Jewish brothers and sisters to come to faith in Yeshua at any moment.
Yeah. And apparently this was becoming an issue for even the believing community, because where it says, do not neglect the synagogue, as is the habit of some. That word habit is the word ethos, where we get the word ethic or law or prescription. So some apparently were trying to turn that into, well, fine, you've kicked us out, we're not coming back.
Or you might have been seeing that, and you were starting to see that actually within the Gentile
body.
Yeah.
They were wanting to reject that synagogue foundation of faith, that Jewish foundation of faith. And some were making that a rule, and it became a rule later in over the next couple of hundred years, to where not only were things like the dates changed from Shabbat to Sunday worship, but they made it illegal to keep the Shabbat. They made it illegal to keep the feasts.
To eat with Jews.
To eat with Jewish people, to fellowship with Jewish people. So it was very anti-Semitic. And so the rules began growing and cropping up to where saying we can no longer have fellowship with these people at all.
Do you see why we were kind of excited about Hebrews chapter 10? A lot is culminating here.
Yes.
An awful lot is culminating in this chapter.
Because ultimately, again, what is the goal of the mystery of God that Ephesians talks about in chapters 1 through 3?
Becoming one.
The Jew and the Gentile coming together as one new man. And if we neglect and give up the synagogue, how is that going to happen? If we break fellowship with the synagogue...
Now, obviously, that fellowship has been broken.
Yes.
Right? But...
that's not what God has for us.
We are also seeing a coming back together in some sense. Some people within even the Orthodox community or the conservative community within Judaism, they're starting to understand that, wait a minute, these Messianics, you know, we may disagree with them on who the Messiah is, but they are our Jewish brothers and sisters, as much as we've tried to deny that, and they're seeing anti-Semitism growing around the world, and some of them are beginning to realize that, wait a minute, regardless of our differences, we may still need each other. Mm-hmm.
And they may still be targeted for anti-Semitism too.
Yes.
And in fact, even though we're not Jewish, but the fact that we worship on Shabbat and keep the feasts, guess what? We may be a target too. We understand that. I'm not looking forward to that any more than anybody else does. But, you know, because we may understand differences, or we may, the Orthodox community may say we disagree on Messiah and who that is, and we have some disagreements or whatever else. But somebody on the outside looking in is not going to know or understand those differences. So we are going to need each other, and in order for the goal of one new man to be made manifest, we need to live out this verse of Hebrews 10:25, and that is not neglecting the synagogue, episynagoge.
Because the enemy is going to come against God's people. All those who believe in the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not all of them may understand who Messiah is yet, but Satan doesn't like them.
No.
And Satan doesn't like the believing community either, those who believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. And so he's going to come against both of us.
And for those of us who know Messiah and who believe Messiah, as we see the hostility turn up, especially as it begins to target the Jewish people, as anti-Semitism increases, we're going to have to decide who we're going to support. You know, what side we're going to be on. We will not be able to be silent in the face of this anti-Semitism that is rising all the more, not only around the world over in Europe, but also even right here in our own country.
Oh, wow, yes.
Anti-Semitism is on the rise, with the cemeteries being vandalized, with people up in New York, they're walking down the street and getting ambushed and beaten. Mm-hmm. Several of them being shot and killed. I mean, that's within the last 6 months, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Things of that sort. So we're going to have to understand that the world is going to start turning more and more against Israel, against the Jewish people. And we're not going to be able to be idle on that issue. So, and because in some respects, what's going to turn and hit them is also going to turn and hit us.
Whether we worship on Shabbat or not.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Because at some point it's a hostility toward God in general.
Yes.
And anyone who reminds a person of God is going to be a target.
Right.
So we need to encourage one another to keep the fellowship. As much as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. and all the more so as you see the day approaching. For if we keep on sinning, and again, what is the definition of sin? It's breaking of the Torah. If we keep on breaking the Torah willfully, after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but only a terrifying expectation of judgment and a fury of fire about to devour the enemies of God. So anyone who rejected the Torah of Moses dies without compassion on the word of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's the legal standard of judicial type of situation. Nobody can be convicted in a Jewish court on the testimony of only one witness. They have to have multiple witnesses, 2 or 3 witnesses, in order to establish a matter. That's what they had such a hard time doing at the trial of Yeshua. They could not get the witnesses to agree.
Right. Finally, they had 2 false witnesses come in and say the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So they worked on ironing out their story.
Right.
But anyone who rejected the Torah of Moses, this is that legal standard, dies without compassion on the word of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much more severe do you think the punishment will be for the one who has trampled the Son of God, Ben Elohim, underfoot, and has regarded as unholy the blood of the covenant by which he was made holy, and has insulted the Spirit of grace? All right, this is talking about somebody who is intentionally turning back.
Yes.
Intentionally rejecting Yeshua in order to get back in good standing into the temple.
Right. Correct.
All right. You were saved, by grace and all those things, but if you turn around and curse him, and you know full well what you're doing, you are cursing underfoot. You are trampling underfoot the Son of God. And that's why he goes back to in chapter 6. Let's see, where was that? I'm not used to seeing it on this page. Basically, it's chapter 6, verse 4 of Hebrews. If you have once been enlightened, you've tasted the heavenly gift, you've tasted the good word of God, and then having fallen away, it's impossible to renew again to repentance, since they are crucifying the Son of God for themselves and publicly disgracing him. So if you're going to go that way, and you're going to renounce Yeshua, I mean, this is not just I've sinned again and I messed up, I wonder if I've lost my salvation.
No.
This is I am turning my back on Yeshua, and I am publicly rejecting him and spitting on his name and everything else like that. That's not just I messed up again. That's an intentional cursing. So you are trampling the Son of God underfoot and regarded as unholy the blood of the covenant by which you were made holy, and has insulted the Spirit of grace. For we know the one who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." In other words, you're going to have to stand before God with that. You're going to have to answer to him for that. And again, Adonai will judge his people, and it is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And that is absolutely true. I mean, there's Jonathan Edwards' most famous sermon was "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And because he hates sin.
Yes, he does.
And so if you don't have the covering of Yeshua and you're standing there in your own right, then the wrath of God will come upon you. And there's no one who's going to be innocent of that, because we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so no one is innocent. The ones who live are the ones who have one who is interceding for them, and that is the high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
Yes.
We can try to finish out 10. What do you think?
Yeah,
let's
finish out 10. Let's finish out 10.
All right. So chapter 10 of Hebrews, verse 32. But remember the former days, when after you were enlightened, you endured a great struggle with sufferings. So, I mean, they often did endure struggles and persecution or rejection because they began to accept Yeshua as Messiah. So, guys, remember, this started from day one for most of you.
Yeah.
Sometimes you were publicly exposed to abuses and afflictions, and other times you became partners with those who were treated this way, so guilty by association. For you suffered along with the prisoners and joyfully accepted the plundering of your possessions, knowing that you have for yourselves a better and lasting possession. So some of them lost everything in coming to Yeshua. Some of them lost their job, their livelihood, their house, their family, their children. They lost everything in coming to Yeshua. And they're like, you've already lost everything. What do you think you're going to gain? You have a better and a lasting possession, a better and a lasting inheritance. As Yeshua said, anybody who has not given up or lost father and mother, sisters and brothers, you're going to gain so many more. Right. He says in verse 35, therefore, because of this, do not lose your boldness. Don't let that fire die out for Yeshua, in spite of all that you're seeing, in spite of the fact that you've been kicked out of the temple. Don't lose your boldness for Yeshua, which has great reward, for you need perseverance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. And again, that's that promise that goes all the way back to the one that was given to Abram. Receiving that inheritance, receiving that promise of that Shabbat rest that is to come, that he talked about in chapter 4, because the Sabbath is really a part of our inheritance.
Yes, it is.
The day of rest.
Yeah, harkening back to that promise is definitely a harkening back to that Abrahamic covenant.
Mm-hmm. For yet in a very little while, how soon did they think this was all going to happen?
Very little while.
It's like, we say that we have to be prepared, that it might be what if it's today or what if it's tomorrow. We say that.
They lived that way.
Yeah. We say that, and it's been 2,000 years, and I don't think we live with the same kind of urgency that they did at all. No. It was right around the corner.
They lived that way.
So in a very little while, the coming one will come, and he will not delay. All right, this was all happening quickly. They certainly expected it in their lifetime.
Right.
But my righteous one shall live by faith, by emunah. And if he shrinks back, my soul takes no pleasure in him. But we are not among the timid ones on the path to destruction, but among the faithful ones on the path to the preservation of the soul. He's like, the timid ones are ones that go back. That's the seed that's thrown into the soil, the shallow soil that, sure, okay, it springs up for a little while, but as soon as persecutions and troubles come, it's gone. It's the fair weather Christian type of a thing. As long as everything is great, sure.
My way?
Yeah.
The way I want it to?
Yeah. We'll trust in God, sure. But as soon as it becomes hard, as soon as it's not your best life now or whatever else that so deceives so many people these days, then it's the accusation that Satan makes about Job. You take all that stuff away and he'll curse you to your face. That's how Satan expects most people's faith to go. You keep them comfortable, you keep blessing them and providing them with everything. Sure, they'll say they love you, but they really don't, because they love you for the stuff. They love you for the good times and for the blessing. If they don't have that, then they won't love you at all. And he is saying, no, that's not the kind of faith that we have. No. We are not among the timid ones on the path to destruction, but among the faithful ones on the path to the preservation of the soul.
And then, of course, chapter 11 is example after example after example of people who had that kind of faith. And
he says, and you are going to be like them. You are a person of faith, just like all of these people in chapter 11, the roll call of faith, as it's called. You have the same kind of faith that they do if you understand and live like they lived. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of realities not seen. Yeah, you don't see it right now. Yeah, you may have a hard time understanding how it's all going to work out. Yeah, you may only see the problem and the issue right in front of you, but do you trust the promise?
Yeah, and let's go. I want to go to the very last two verses of chapter 11. And it says, and all these he had just listed, right? That they all knew.
Go back to 36.
Go back to 36. Okay. I was going to quickly make a point.
Well,
okay. Verse 36. Others experienced the trial of mocking and scourging, yes, and even chains and prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. That would be Isaiah. They were murdered with the sword. They were went around in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute, afflicted, mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered around in the deserts and mountains, caves and holes in the ground. And here we go. And all these, though commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that only with us would they reach perfection. He wants all of his people together. Mm-hmm. What they went through, the believers in the first century, we are included in that.
And the believers.
So that when Yeshua comes back, it's all of us together.
And it's the believers from the Old Testament.
Which is what he's just got done listing.
Yeah.
Right?
So we are in the same legacy of faith.
Yes.
We are all looking back. The Old Testament saints, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, all of those guys, they were looking forward to the coming of Messiah and what Messiah would do. They didn't see it, yet they held on, even though they had intense, terrible things happening, and they did not get to see with their own eyes the events themselves. They held on by faith to those things.
So that together with the believers, even of today, because we're including that because we're still waiting for the one who's coming, right?
Yeah.
We're still waiting. And so, we're included in that. And y'all, that right there throws out the concept of dispensationalism. That was then, this is now. No, God says that all of them together,
it's not a different
will reach
age.
Perfection.
Yeah, it's not a different age. He's not doing something different in them, and he's not doing a different method of salvation. He's not doing a different path or a different work. The only way that we can all be considered people of faith, like unto them, as if he is working all of us in the same direction and the same goal.
We will be glorified together.
Yeah.
We will be raised together.
So this is not a different age and a different era. No. This has been the era all along from Abraham. It's been the same plan and purpose and function and goal.
They were looking forward to the same thing we're looking forward to. They were looking forward to the kingdom. If they weren't, they wouldn't have talked about it so much. But they did. They were looking forward to the kingdom when the king is on the throne, the king that will be there forever. Right? When Messiah is on the throne.
Yep.
And we're still looking forward to that day. And we will reach that day together.
And we may have seen more of that plan laid out than they have, from the Old Testament. We've seen glimpses and seen parts of it more than they have. Because Messiah did come.
Yes.
He did die. He was raised.
Yes.
Yeshua himself said that Abraham looked forward to seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. Yeah. That's John chapter 8.
The Abrahamic covenant.
And so, we have seen some of the things that Abraham has looked forward to, but we're both still looking forward to things that have yet to be fulfilled.
Right.
And that's where we're at. We're in that same line and legacy of faith that started all the way back then.
Amen.
Amen. Now we need to stop there because
Yep.
we're getting more long-winded, I think, every night.
But yeah, chapter 10 was so good, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
All right. Well, may the Lord bless y'all. Be sure and share these videos, or if you do have any questions, to write them down and send them our way. We can try to address them. If you do have anything that you wanted to send to us as far as support for this ministry and such, our P.O. box is 1271 in Talbot, Tennessee, 37877. But we're also hoping to look and get back to meeting together if things goes as planned at the end of the month. So I think it's May 30th. So if you're in East Tennessee and you want to join us, we'd love to have you come and be a part of it. We're meeting at downtown Morristown at First Baptist Church. They give us some space there.
Amen.
And we look forward to it. So with all of that, y'all have a good night. And we look forward to seeing everybody again. All right.
Amen.
So shalom.